There is something people rarely understand about deep feelers. They think you stay because you are weak, because you are naive, because you cannot let go, because you love too hard. But that is usually not the truth. The truth is far more complicated. Because deep feelers do not love casually. They do not attach casually. And they definitely do not leave casually. When they love, they build meaning around people, memory around people, hope around people, even after the relationship starts hurting, even after disappointment begins repeating itself, even after the loneliness quietly moves into the room. Because if you are someone who feels deeply, you probably know exactly what this feels like. The moment when something starts changing, you begin noticing the inconsistency, the distance, the subtle ache of giving more than you receive. But instead of leaving, you explain, you rationalize, you tell yourself, they're struggling, they're overwhelmed, they've just been hurt before, things will get better. And somewhere inside that hope, you quietly start carrying more pain than you realize. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because deep feelers often confuse endurance with devotion. They think, if I stay through the hard parts, if I keep loving them through this, maybe that means the love is real. And maybe nobody taught you this. But sometimes the people who love the deepest also stay the longest in places that slowly break them. Not because they are weak, but because they see possibility where others see warning signs. They see the wounded child underneath the behavior, the pain beneath the distance, the tenderness hiding behind the inconsistency. And when you see people that deeply, leaving can feel almost impossible, because you are not just leaving who they are, you are leaving who you believe they could become. And that grief, it is enormous, because deep feelers often fall in love with potential, not intentionally, but naturally. You remember the soft moments, the late night conversations, the glimpses of closeness, the promises, the vulnerability, the version of them that felt safe, even if it only appeared sometimes. And your brain quietly turns those moments into proof. See, they care. See, the relationship is still there. See, this can still work. But there is something psychology teaches us that matters deeply here. Human beings do not bond most strongly through consistency alone. Sometimes, we bond hardest through unpredictability. And this changes everything. Because when love becomes inconsistent, when warmth appears and disappears, the nervous system often becomes more attached, not less. Strangely enough, certainty calms us, but inconsistency hooks us. One loving moment, one painful moment, one moment of closeness, one moment of distance, and suddenly, your heart becomes invested in finding safety again, trying to get back to how things felt in the beginning, trying to recreate the connection you know exists, or at least the connection you once believed existed. And this is where hope becomes complicated, because hope can be beautiful. Hope helps people survive. Hope helps people heal. Hope gives us meaning. But hope, without honesty, can quietly trap us, because deep feelers are often incredibly resilient. They can survive emotional winters, long silences, unmet needs, loneliness, confusion, and instead of asking, why am I tolerating this? They ask, how can I love them better? Which sounds compassionate, loyal, beautiful even, until you realize what is happening underneath it. Because slowly, without noticing, you stop asking what you need. You stop noticing how tired you are, how lonely you are, how much of yourself you have started sacrificing. And if this sounds familiar, I want to pause here for a second, because maybe nobody ever told you this. Staying is not always proof of love. Sometimes staying is proof of hope. Sometimes staying is proof of fear. Sometimes staying is proof of an old wound that learned. Love requires endurance. Love requires sacrifice. Love means not giving up. And if somewhere in your life, love felt unpredictable, emotionally unavailable, or hard to earn, you may have quietly learned something dangerous. That closeness must be fought for. That love must be proven. That if you just stay long enough, care deeply enough, understand enough, you will finally feel chosen. This is where attachment quietly enters the story. Because many deep feelers are not just loving from the present, they are loving from memory. Old memory, nervous system memory, childhood memory, the part of them that learned. Do not leave too quickly. Be patient. Understand people. Earn love. And so, when pain arrives inside relationships, they do not leave immediately. They adapt. They become more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, sometimes to the point of self-erasure. Because deep feelers are incredibly skilled at understanding pain, especially other people's pain. But what makes this heartbreaking is that they often become experts at understanding everyone, except themselves. They understand why the other person struggles, why they pull away, why they are inconsistent, why they are wounded. But they struggle to ask the harder question: what is this relationship doing to me? Because somewhere deep down, they are still hoping, hoping the person changes, hoping the relationship returns to what it once felt like, hoping love eventually feels safe. And hope is powerful, but hope can also keep someone standing in the rain, long after the storm has stopped being temporary. And maybe the hardest truth of all is this: deep feelers do not usually leave because they stop loving. They leave when staying hurts more than hoping. And by then, they are often exhausted, quietly heartbroken, and wondering how they stayed so long in something that hurt them so deeply. But to understand why this happens, we need to talk about something even more difficult. Because sometimes, the thing keeping deep feelers trapped is not love, it is hope. And that changes everything. Sometimes the hardest relationships to leave are the ones that still occasionally feel beautiful. Not consistently beautiful, not safely beautiful, just enough, just enough warmth to keep hope alive. And if you are a deep feeler, you probably know exactly what that means. Because the relationship is not painful all the time. That would almost be easier. If someone hurt you every single day, ignored you constantly, never cared, never tried, your nervous system would likely stop fighting so hard to stay. But that is rarely how painful relationships actually work. Instead, they become confusing. One week feels hopeful, the next feels lonely. One moment feels deeply connected, the next feels distant, cold, uncertain, and your heart starts living inside contradiction. Because now you are not grieving what the relationship is, you are grieving what it sometimes becomes. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Because deep feelers often do not stay for the pain. They stay for the moments that temporarily make the pain feel worth it. The apology, the vulnerability, the affection, the version of the relationship that briefly feels safe again. And suddenly, your nervous system relaxes. You think, there they are. This is the person I fell for. See, we're okay. But then distance returns. The inconsistency returns. The unmet needs return. And now something exhausting begins happening inside you. You start emotionally chasing certainty, trying to get back to the good version, trying to recreate the closeness, trying to solve what keeps breaking. And psychology has a name for this: intermittent reinforcement, which sounds clinical, but what it really means is this: the brain becomes deeply attached to unpredictable rewards. Strangely enough, consistent love calms the nervous system. But inconsistent love, it often intensifies attachment. Because uncertainty creates emotional hunger. Your brain starts waiting for the next good moment, the next apology, the next moment of closeness, the next sign that things are finally changing. And deep feelers, especially hopeful ones, are incredibly vulnerable to this. Not because they are foolish, but because they believe in repair. They believe people can heal. They believe hard seasons pass. They believe love deserves patience. And sometimes that is beautiful, but other times that same hope becomes the very thing keeping them stuck. Because somewhere along the way, they stop relating to the relationship as it is and begin relating to what it could become. That version, the healed version, the emotionally available version, the version where the effort is finally mutual, where communication improves, where closeness stops feeling fragile, where love stops feeling lonely. And because deep feelers have vivid emotional imagination, they can almost feel that future, almost touch it, which makes walking away feel unbearable. Because now you are not just leaving a person, you are leaving the dream, the possibility, the story your heart quietly built. And grief becomes complicated when you are mourning something that never fully existed. Maybe pause here for a second, because if you have ever stayed too long, I wonder if part of you believed, if I just love harder, understand deeper, become softer, become more patient, maybe this will finally feel safe. And if that is true, I want you to hear something carefully. Love should not require you to disappear. Patience should not cost you your peace. And understanding someone else should never mean abandoning yourself. Because there comes a point in painful relationships where empathy quietly turns into self-neglect. You understand their wounds, so you excuse behavior. You understand their fears, so you silence your needs. You understand their trauma, so you shrink your expectations. And without noticing, your world becomes smaller, your voice softer, your needs quieter, your standards lower. Not because you stopped matching, but because survival inside emotionally painful relationships often teaches people to minimize themselves, to become easier to love, less demanding, less emotional, less human. And the heartbreaking part? Deep feelers rarely notice this happening in real time because they are too busy trying to protect the connection, too busy trying to understand, too busy trying to hold everything together. Until one day, they look in the mirror and quietly wonder, when did I become this tired? When did I start accepting so little? When did loving someone begin hurting this much? Because pain rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates, quietly, slowly, like emotional erosion. And this is why people outside the relationship often do not understand. They ask, why didn't you just leave? As if leaving is simple, as if attachment is logical, as if love does not become tangled with memory, hope, fear, loneliness, identity. Because deep feelers are not just trying to save the relationship. Sometimes, they are trying to save the version of themselves that believed love could still work. And that is why painful relationships become so hard to release. Not because the deep feeler cannot see reality, but because hope keeps editing reality, softening it, explaining it, protecting it. And maybe this next part is difficult to hear, but sometimes hope becomes a hiding place, a way to delay grief. Because if you keep believing things might change, you do not have to fully face what is hurting you now. And that is terrifying, because facing reality sometimes means admitting, I love someone who cannot meet me where I am. I keep pouring into something that keeps draining me. I am exhausted, and deep feelers hate giving up, especially on people, especially on love, especially on potential. But there is a difference between loyalty and emotional self-abandonment. And learning that difference changes everything. Because eventually, whether quietly or painfully, every deep feeler arrives at the same impossible question. Am I staying because this relationship is healthy, or because I am terrified of letting go of what I hoped it could become? And maybe that is the question nobody prepares deep feelers for. Because the moment you start asking it honestly, something inside you begins shifting. Slowly, quietly, almost painfully. You start noticing things you spent so long explaining away. The loneliness, the inconsistency, how tired you have become, how much of yourself has quietly disappeared while trying to preserve the relationship. And at first, this realization does not feel empowering. It feels heartbreaking because deep feelers rarely struggle to love others. What they struggle with is accepting that love alone cannot save something that keeps hurting them. That truth hurts, especially if you are someone who believes in growth, healing, second chances, because deep feelers do not love casually. They invest emotionally, mentally, spiritually. They remember details, carry stories, hold tenderness for people long after most would have walked away. So when someone says, just leave, it feels almost impossible because leaving is not just ending a relationship. It feels like betraying the hope you carried for so long. And hope, for deep feelers, can feel sacred because maybe you saw goodness in them. Maybe you saw pain beneath the behavior. Maybe you understood why they struggled, why they shut down, why they hurt people. And understanding someone deeply creates a dangerous temptation. The temptation to overstay, to believe compassion will eventually heal incompatibility, to believe patience will eventually create reciprocity, to believe love can finally convince someone to choose you consistently. But there is something painful we need to talk about, because understanding someone and being emotionally safe with someone are not the same thing. You can deeply understand a person and still be deeply hurt by them. You can have compassion for someone's wounds and still recognize those wounds are hurting you. You can love someone and still acknowledge they are not capable of loving you in the way you need. And this might be one of the hardest lessons deep feelers ever learn, because many deep feelers unconsciously believe, if I understand them enough, I can survive this. But relationships were never meant to be survived. They were meant to be experienced, felt, shared, safe enough to rest inside. And if love constantly feels like confusion, uncertainty, walking on emotional eggshells, you are not failing for feeling exhausted. You are human. Maybe pause here for a second, because if you are someone who stays too long, I wonder if you learned somewhere in your life that love meant endurance, that love meant proving yourself, that leaving meant failure, that if you just tried harder, someone would finally choose you. Sometimes this begins earlier than we realize. In childhood, in emotionally inconsistent homes, in relationships where love felt conditional, unpredictable, something you had to earn, and the nervous system remembers, even when the mind forgets, which is why so many deep feelers confuse familiarity with safety. They say, this feels intense, this feels important, this feels like love. But sometimes, what feels familiar is simply what feels known, even if it hurts. Especially if somewhere deep down, love always carried uncertainty, because the nervous system often repeats what it recognizes before it learns what it deserves. And this is where self-abandonment quietly begins. Not dramatically, quietly. You stop speaking up because you do not want conflict. You stop asking for reassurance because you do not want to seem needy. You stop expressing disappointment because you are afraid they will pull away. And without realizing it, you begin shaping yourself around someone else's limitations. smaller, softer, more patient, more understanding, until one day, you barely recognize yourself. Because deep feelers often become experts at carrying relationships, holding emotional weight, maintaining hope, giving grace. But eventually, even the deepest hearts get tired, not of loving, but of loving alone. And there comes a moment, quietly, where something begins changing. You stop chasing as hard. You stop explaining as much. You stop begging life to finally become what you hoped it would be. And for the first time, you begin asking a different kind of question. Not, how do I save this relationship? But, what would happen if I finally stopped abandoning myself? That question changes people, because healing often begins there, not when love disappears, but when clarity arrives, when you finally understand. Staying loyal to someone else while betraying yourself is not love, it is survival. And survival can look a lot like devotion when you have been hurting for a long time. But there is something strangely beautiful that starts happening when deep feelers stop pouring all their energy into fixing what keeps hurting them. They begin remembering themselves, their peace, their voice, their boundaries, their joy, the version of them that existed before exhaustion moved in. And no, this does not happen overnight, especially not for people who love deeply, because grief still arrives. You still miss them, still replay the good moments, still wonder if maybe things could have changed. Deep feelers grieve hard because they loved hard, but slowly, something shifts. The same heart that kept someone else alive emotionally for years begins turning inward. And for the first time in a very long time, care stops feeling one sided. Because maybe healing was never about becoming someone who loves less. Maybe healing is learning how to love deeply without abandoning yourself in the process. And that sounds beautiful in theory. But real healing asks something harder. It asks you to release something many deep feelers secretly cling to, the belief that love alone can save what effort never changed. Because sometimes, the bravest thing a deep feeler ever learns is not how to stay, but how to stop bleeding for a future that never arrives. And that is where everything begins to change. And maybe this is the part nobody talks about enough. What happens after? After the realization, after the heartbreak, after you finally admit to yourself, this relationship is hurting me. Because if you are a deep feeler, letting go rarely feels empowering at first. It feels devastating, like grief mixed with guilt, relief mixed with sadness, freedom mixed with longing. Because deep feelers do not just lose people, they lose dreams, the future they imagined, the version of the relationship they kept believing would finally arrive. And maybe that is what makes healing feel so confusing. Because sometimes, you do not miss the relationship itself. You miss the hope, the possibility, the moments that made you believe things were changing. You miss who they sometimes became. And that grief is real. Even if the relationship was painful, even if leaving was necessary, even if staying was slowly breaking you. Because hearts do not suddenly stop caring simply because the mind understands. And healing, especially for people who feel deeply, is rarely linear. Some days you will feel clear, certain, proud of yourself, and then suddenly, a memory returns, a song, a text thread, a late night thought, and grief quietly knocks again. That does not mean you made the wrong choice. It means you are human. It means you loved. It means part of you is still learning how to loosen its grip on something it once fought so hard to protect. Maybe pause here for a second, because if you have stayed too long before, I wonder how much of your life has been spent trying to prove your love, trying to earn consistency, trying to convince someone to meet you where you already were. trying to become easier to love, smaller, quieter, more understanding. And maybe, just maybe, you were never asking for too much. Maybe you were simply asking the wrong person. Because healthy love does not constantly leave you confused. Healthy love does not make you question your worth every week. Healthy love does not punish you for having needs. Yes, every relationship has hard seasons, miscommunication, imperfection, moments of distance. But healthy love repairs. Healthy love turns toward you. Healthy love makes room for your humanity. And perhaps the hardest thing deep feelers ever learn is that being needed is not the same thing as being loved. Being chosen inconsistently is not the same thing as being cherished. And potential, no matter how beautiful, is not the same thing as reality. Because eventually, you stop asking, who could they become? And start asking, who are they showing me they are right now? That question changes everything. Because clarity does not make you cold, it makes you honest. And honesty is where healing finally begins. Not the kind of healing that hardens you, not the kind that makes you stop loving, but the kind that teaches you. You are allowed to love deeply without sacrificing yourself. You are allowed to care without carrying the relationship alone. You are allowed to stay soft without staying in places that slowly break you. Because deep feelers do not need to love less. They need to stop confusing suffering with devotion. And maybe this next part matters most. If you are someone who stays too long, someone who sees the good in people, someone who keeps hoping, someone who keeps loving long after everyone else says leave, I hope you hear this clearly. Your depth is not the problem. Your heart is not the problem. The problem begins when your love becomes permission for someone else to stop showing up. You deserve reciprocity. You deserve consistency. You deserve the kind of love that feels safe enough to rest inside. The kind of love where you do not have to constantly earn closeness, or explain why your needs matter, or shrink yourself to keep the connection alive. Because real love, healthy love, does not ask you to disappear in order to keep it. And maybe healing begins the moment you stop asking, how do I keep this relationship alive? And start asking, what kind of life becomes possible when I finally choose myself too? Because there is a version of you, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the heartbreak, beneath the years of overgiving, who still exists, still worthy, still hopeful, still capable of loving deeply. But this time, without abandoning themselves. And maybe that version of you deserves a chance. So if this spoke to something inside you, I want to ask you something honest. Have you ever stayed too long in a relationship because you believed love would eventually fix it? Or are you finally learning the difference between loving someone and losing yourself? Tell me in the comments. I read them. And if this journey of healing, attachment, and understanding the deeper psychology of love speaks to you, subscribe to the Inner Odyssey. Because here, we do not just talk about relationships, we talk about the hidden emotional patterns shaping them, so you can stop repeating pain and start understanding yourself in a deeper way. And until next time, be gentle with the parts of you that stayed. They were only trying to love the best way they knew how.